The whispers started the moment he stepped into Arlington National Cemetery. An old man wearing a dress uniform faded by decades, its fabric loose on his frail frame. Eyes darted, stifled chuckles rippled through the perfectly polished crowd gathered for General Patterson's funeral. Military dignitaries exchanged discreet glances, some pointing quietly at the man they assumed was playing dress-up, a forgotten relic trying to relive past glories. But as the chaplain's voice rose over the hush, calling the roll of honors, the atmosphere shifted. When he announced, Silver Star recipient, Staff Sergeant Eddie Martinez, every whisper instantly died. The murmurs stopped cold. The air grew thick with silence as every head slowly turned, every eye searching for the man behind the name. The same figure they had mocked just moments before stood there, steady and proud. The faded uniform he wore wasn't a costume. It was the very same one he had earned in battle, the one he wore 50 years ago when he saved General Patterson's life at great personal cost. In that suspended moment, the crowd understood. Respect replaced ridicule, and the ceremony paused to honor a true hero who had walked among them unnoticed until now. Welcome to Echoes of Honor. Before we continue this moving story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The morning fog hung low over Arlington National Cemetery as mourners gathered for the funeral of General Robert Patterson, a decorated officer who had served with distinction through 3 wars and 2 decades of peacetime leadership. The ceremony drew military elite from across the nation, each wearing their dress uniforms with precision and pride that spoke of careers built on discipline and attention to detail. Medals gleamed in the filtered sunlight. Ribbons were arranged in perfect order according to regulations, and every crease spoke of military discipline and the kind of attention to detail that separated true professionals from weekend warriors. Among this sea of spit and polish perfection stood Eddie Martinez, 78 years old, and wearing the same dress blue uniform he'd been issued in 1971 when he was a young sergeant preparing for his first deployment to Southeast Asia. The shoulders were slightly too wide now for his aged frame, the result of decades of civilian life that had gradually diminished the broad chest and powerful build that had once filled the uniform properly. The blue had faded to a softer shade after decades of careful storage in mothballs and tissue paper, brought out only for the most solemn occasions. The brass buttons, though polished with the same care he'd learned in basic training, showed the patina of time and the slight, where that came from half a century of existence. To the casual observer, particularly those accustomed to the crisp perfection of modern military dress uniforms with their advanced fabrics and precise tailoring, Eddie looked like an old man playing soldier. His uniform represented an era when military clothing was built for function rather than appearance, when durability mattered more than fashion, when a uniform was expected to last a career rather than be replaced every few years as styles and regulations evolved. He'd driven 16 hours from his small apartment in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to attend this funeral, spending money he couldn't really afford on gas, a motel room, and the meals he'd need for the round-trip journey. Eddie lived on a fixed income that barely covered his medications for his heart condition and diabetes, his rent for the 1-bedroom apartment he'd called home for the past 15 years, and the basic necessities that kept him going from month to month. But when he'd heard about General Patterson's death on the evening news, reading the obituary that mentioned the general's distinguished service in Vietnam, nothing could have kept him away from this final tribute. The uniform had been carefully pressed the night before in his motel room, using the iron provided by the front desk and techniques he'd learned 50 years ago from a drill sergeant who insisted that a wrinkled uniform was a sign of a wrinkled mind. Eddie had stood before the small mirror in the budget motel bathroom, adjusting ribbons with arthritic fingers and ensuring everything was as correct as possible, knowing it would never meet the standards of contemporary military dress, but hoping it would convey the respect he felt for the occasion and the man being honored. As mourners filed into their assigned seating areas according to the detailed protocol that governed military funerals at Arlington, Eddie found a spot near the back of the gathering, in the section reserved for general attendees rather than distinguished guests or family members. He'd learned decades ago not to draw attention to himself, Not to presume he belonged among the high-ranking officials and distinguished guests who filled the front rows with their perfect uniforms and impressive arrays of ribbons and decorations that told stories of distinguished careers and important assignments. Several people noticed him during the gathering period before the ceremony began, their expressions ranging from curious to mildly amused to openly critical. A few whispered comments reached his ears about weekend warriors and wannabes and stolen valor. Assumptions made by people who had never learned to look beyond surface appearances to understand the deeper truths that uniforms could represent. Eddie kept his eyes forward, focused on the flag-draped casket ahead, drawing on decades of practice in ignoring the opinions of people who had never shared his experiences. Colonel Sarah Williams, General Patterson's aide-de-camp and the officer responsible for coordinating the funeral proceedings, was moving through the crowd making final preparations when she spotted Eddie among the gathering. Her first instinct was professional concern based on years of training that emphasized security and protocol. Someone was wearing what appeared to be an ill-fitting vintage uniform to a high-profile military funeral attended by some of the most senior officers in the American military establishment. She made a mental note to have security discreetly verify his credentials, assuming he might be a well-meaning civilian who'd purchased surplus military clothing for the occasion, or perhaps someone with mental health issues who believed he was a veteran when he wasn't. The ceremony began with the precision and dignity expected of Arlington National Cemetery, where every detail had been rehearsed and every participant understood their role in honoring the deceased. An honor guard moved with mechanical perfection, their every step choreographed and practiced until it became second nature, their uniforms immaculate, and their bearing reflecting the solemnity of the occasion. The military band played with solemn dignity as distinguished speakers took their turns at the podium, sharing memories of General Patterson's service, his character, his contributions to military doctrine, and his influence on the thousands of soldiers who had served under his command during his distinguished career. Eddie listened to each speech with the attention of someone who'd known the general personally, who'd served alongside him when they were both younger men facing impossible circumstances in a war that tested every assumption they'd ever had about courage, leadership, and survival. The speakers talked about Patterson's strategic brilliance, his compassionate leadership, his dedication to his soldiers, and his innovations in military tactics that had saved countless lives. Everything they said matched Eddie's memories of the man who'd believed in him when others hadn't, who'd seen potential in a young sergeant from New Mexico when others saw only another enlisted man destined for obscurity. As the formal eulogies concluded, highlighting achievements that spanned 4 decades of military service and touching on the general's influence on military education, strategic planning, and the development of future leaders, the chaplain stepped forward to read the military honors. This was a cherished tradition at Arlington, where the service records of distinguished attendees were acknowledged as part of the ceremony, recognizing the collective sacrifice and service represented by the gathering and ensuring that the assembled heroes received the recognition they deserved. The chaplain held a list of names that had been compiled through careful research and coordination with military personnel offices, each representing decades of service and sacrifice, each telling a story of commitment to country and dedication to the principles that made military service both challenging and rewarding. The reading of these names served multiple purposes. It honored the living heroes present. It connected General Patterson's service to the broader community of military professionals, and it reminded everyone present that they were part of something larger than themselves. The first few names were called with the expected reverence and dignity. Medal of Honor recipient, General Marcus Thompson. The crowd turned respectfully toward a distinguished man in the second row, his chest displaying the nation's highest decoration for valor along with ribbons that told the story of a career built on extraordinary service and personal courage. Quiet applause followed his acknowledgement, the kind of respectful recognition that military communities reserve for their most distinguished members. Navy Cross recipient, Admiral Catherine Hayes. Again, heads turned toward a woman whose bearing commanded immediate respect, her uniform perfect in every detail, her decorations speaking of extraordinary service under fire and leadership in the most challenging circumstances. The Navy Cross represented the second highest decoration for valor, awarded only to those who had demonstrated exceptional courage in combat situations that tested the limits of human endurance and determination. The chaplain continued down his list, each name representing remarkable service and sacrifice that had contributed to the security and freedom that Americans often took for granted. Distinguished Service Cross recipient, General James Morrison. Silver Star recipient, Colonel Patricia Rodriguez. Each acknowledgement was met with respectful attention and appropriate recognition, the gathered crowd understanding that they were in the presence of extraordinary individuals whose service had shaped the military and the nation. Then the chaplain reached a name that would change everything the gathering thought they knew about heroism, appearance, and the nature of true service. Silver Star recipient, Staff Sergeant Eddie Martinez. The words hung in the air like a challenge to every assumption the gathering had made about who belonged in their midst and what a hero was supposed to look like. For a moment, no one moved, the silence stretching as minds processed the significance of what they'd just heard. The Silver Star was the nation's third highest decoration for valor, awarded only for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States that went far beyond the call of duty. It represented courage under fire that few people could imagine, let alone demonstrate when the moment of testing arrived. Slowly, heads began to turn throughout the gathering, searching the crowd for this decorated hero whose name had been called with the same reverence reserved for generals and admirals. Eyes scanned the front rows first, expecting to find another perfectly groomed military dignitary with an impressive array of ribbons and decorations. When no one stepped forward from the expected areas, the search expanded backward through the gathering, confusion growing as people realized that the Silver Star recipient wasn't among the obvious candidates in the front sections. Someone in the middle of the gathering spotted Eddie first, the man in the faded uniform standing quietly near the back, his weathered hands clasped behind him in a posture that suddenly seemed less like an old man playing dress-up and more like a soldier standing at attention with the bearing that came from decades of military training and experience. As recognition spread through the crowd like wildfire, whispers took on a completely different tone, embarrassment replacing amusement as people realized what they had done. The colonel who had earlier questioned Eddie's presence felt her face flush with shame and embarrassment. The officers who had smirked at his appearance now saw the uniform differently, not as a costume worn by someone seeking attention, but as the authentic dress blues of a man who'd earned the right to wear them through blood, courage, and sacrifice in combat situations that most of them had never experienced and hoped they never would. The chaplain, realizing the profound significance of the moment and understanding that something extraordinary was happening that transcended normal funeral protocol, departed from his prepared script with the kind of spontaneous wisdom that comes from years of ministering to military families. Staff Sergeant Martinez, he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery with newfound respect and recognition. Would you please step forward so that we may properly acknowledge your service and sacrifice? Eddie hesitated for a long moment, his natural instinct toward humility and anonymity warring with the recognition that this was not a request he could politely decline. He'd spent 5 decades avoiding attention, content to honor his service privately without seeking recognition or acclaim. But the chaplain's request wasn't really a request. It was an acknowledgement that couldn't be ignored, a moment when private service needed to become public recognition for the benefit of everyone present. Slowly, with the measured pace of someone who had learned to move with dignity despite the physical limitations that came with age and old injuries, Eddie made his way through the crowd toward the front of the gathering. His gait was steady despite his years, his bearing growing more obviously military with each step as he unconsciously reverted to the posture and movement patterns that had been drilled into him during basic training and reinforced through years of service. As he walked forward, the crowd began to understand what they were witnessing with a clarity that was both humbling and transformative. This wasn't an old man in a costume seeking attention or recognition. This was a genuine war hero whose service had been overlooked because his uniform didn't meet contemporary standards of military fashion. The faded blue wasn't a sign of neglect or disrespect. It was evidence of age and careful preservation, of a uniform that had been maintained with love and respect despite limited financial resources. The loose fit wasn't about poor tailoring or inappropriate dress. It was about a man whose body had changed over 50 years of civilian life, while his commitment to honoring special occasions remained constant. When Eddie reached the front of the gathering, where the most distinguished military leaders stood in their perfect uniforms with their impressive arrays of decorations, the chaplain continued reading from a citation that had been pulled from official military records and verified through the appropriate channels. Staff Sergeant Martinez was awarded the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action on March 15, 1971, near An Loc, Republic of Vietnam. The crowd fell completely silent as the chaplain read the citation that many of them were hearing for the first time, words that described actions most of them could barely imagine and few would ever be called upon to demonstrate. When his commanding officer, then Lieutenant Robert Patterson, was wounded by enemy fire and pinned down in an exposed position under heavy enemy fire, Staff Sergeant Martinez single-handedly assaulted an enemy machine gun position, eliminating the threat and carrying his wounded officer to safety under heavy fire. His actions saved Lieutenant Patterson's life and enabled the successful completion of the mission that had strategic importance to ongoing operations in the region. The impact of these words was immediate and profound, rippling through the gathering like an earthquake that rearranged everything they thought they understood about the day's significance. General Patterson, the man they were gathered to honor and remember, owed his life to the decorated veteran they'd been dismissing as irrelevant based on nothing more than the appearance of his uniform. The faded uniform suddenly represented something sacred, the actual clothing worn by a man who'd risked everything to save his commanding officer, enabling a career that would touch thousands of lives over the subsequent decades. Colonel Williams stepped forward, her earlier concerns about Eddie's appearance now replaced by the kind of deep respect and admiration reserved for genuine heroes. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying to the back of the gathering with perfect military courtesy, "General Patterson spoke of you often throughout his career. He never forgot what you did for him that day, and he made sure that everyone who served under him understood the debt he owed to your courage and sacrifice." Eddie's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but clear, carrying the understated dignity that marked genuine heroes who had never learned to think of their actions as anything more than necessary responses to extraordinary circumstances. The general was a good officer and a better man. He would have done the same for any of us if the situation had been reversed. But the crowd now understood that what Eddie had done went far beyond the normal bonds of military duty and camaraderie. He'd saved the life of a man who would go on to serve with distinction for 3 more decades, who would lead thousands of soldiers, who would make strategic decisions that affected national security and save countless lives, who would mentor young officers who would themselves become leaders. Every achievement in General Patterson's subsequent career had been made possible by the courage of the man standing before them in the faded uniform that suddenly seemed more honorable than all the perfect dress blues in the gathering. The ceremony continued, but with a completely different energy and understanding. Eddie was escorted to a seat of honor near the front of the gathering, his presence now recognized as essential to understanding General Patterson's story and the true meaning of military service. When the honor guard presented the folded flag to the general's widow, she insisted that Eddie be included in the presentation, recognizing him as the man who'd made her husband's long and distinguished career possible through a single act of extraordinary courage under fire. After the formal ceremony concluded, Eddie was approached by dozens of officers and enlisted personnel who wanted to shake his hand, thank him for his service, and apologize for their earlier assumptions and judgments. Many admitted their shame at having judged a hero based on appearance rather than substance, learning a lesson about the nature of true service that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. The uniform that had seemed out of place and inappropriate now commanded the deepest respect and admiration. A young lieutenant, wearing a perfectly pressed dress uniform with ribbons earned in recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, approached Eddie with obvious reverence and respect. "Sir," the young officer said, his voice carrying the kind of awe reserved for meeting genuine legends, "I want you to know that studying the action that earned you the Silver Star was part of our tactical training at the Officer Candidate School. Your courage under fire and your refusal to abandon a wounded comrade is still being taught to new soldiers as an example of the highest traditions of military service." Eddie looked at the young lieutenant with genuine surprise, his humility preventing him from understanding the historical significance of his actions. "I didn't know anyone remembered that day or thought it was worth teaching to others, sir," the lieutenant replied with the kind of respect that comes from understanding the true meaning of heroism. "Heroes like you are the reason we study military history and the examples that inspire us to be better soldiers. Your actions didn't just save General Patterson's life. They influenced every decision he made afterward, every soldier he led, every life he touched during his distinguished career. Through him, your courage has touched thousands of military careers and saved countless lives." As the gathering dispersed and people began making their way back to their vehicles, Eddie found himself surrounded by a small group of officers and enlisted personnel who wanted to hear firsthand about the action that had earned his Silver Star and shaped the career of one of the Army's most respected generals. He spoke quietly about that day in Vietnam, describing the events with the modesty typical of genuine heroes who never quite understand why others find their actions remarkable or worthy of special attention. Colonel Williams approached as the group was breaking up, her earlier professional concerns now replaced by the kind of personal respect reserved for exceptional individuals. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," she said with formal military courtesy, "I owe you a sincere apology. I questioned your presence here today based on appearances and assumptions. I should have recognized that a man wearing that uniform to this ceremony had earned the right to be here through service and sacrifice that most of us can only imagine." Eddie smiled gently, his natural graciousness preventing him from holding grudges or harboring resentment. "Colonel, you were doing your job and protecting the ceremony. I understand why you'd be concerned about someone who looked out of place. Sir," she continued, her voice carrying genuine emotion, "I want to make something clear that you need to understand. General Patterson left specific instructions about his funeral arrangements. He wanted any veteran who had served with him to be welcomed with full military honors, regardless of how they were dressed or what they could afford. He specifically mentioned hoping that Eddie Martinez might attend, though he wasn't sure you were still alive or if you would even hear about his death." Eddie's eyes filled with tears for the first time that day, the emotion breaking through the stoic facade he'd maintained throughout the ceremony. "He remembered me after all these years. Sir, he never forgot you for a single day. He kept a copy of your Silver Star citation in his desk drawer for 50 years, reading it whenever he needed to remember what real courage looked like. He used your story to teach young officers about courage, loyalty, and the kind of selfless service that defines the best traditions of military leadership." In his final letter to his family, he wrote that his greatest hope was that someone would find you and let you know how grateful he remained for what you did and how your actions had shaped every day of his subsequent career. As Eddie prepared to leave Arlington National Cemetery for the long drive back to New Mexico, he was approached by a military photographer who asked permission to take his picture for the historical record. "Sir," the photographer explained with the reverence due a living piece of history, "this image belongs in the Army Heritage Foundation and the National Archives. Future generations need to see what a real hero looks like and understand that heroism doesn't depend on perfect uniforms or contemporary fashion." Eddie posed reluctantly, uncomfortable with attention but understanding the importance of the moment and the need to preserve the memory for future generations who needed to understand that service came in many forms. The photograph would later be displayed in the Pentagon, with a caption explaining that heroism isn't about perfect uniforms or contemporary fashion. It's about courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to risk everything for others when the moment of testing arrives. The drive back to New Mexico was different for Eddie than the journey to Arlington had been, filled with reflection and a new understanding of his place in military history. He'd attended the funeral expecting to pay quiet respects to a man who'd influenced his life and shown him what good leadership looked like. Instead, he discovered that his own actions had rippled forward through decades, affecting not just General Patterson's life, but everyone the general had subsequently led, influenced, and mentored during his distinguished career. For 50 years, Eddie had carried the memory of that day in Vietnam as a simple matter of duty, one soldier helping another in a moment of crisis when action was required and hesitation could have meant death. He'd never understood that his actions had historical significance, that military academies taught his tactics, that his courage had become a standard against which other acts of valor were measured, or that his name was spoken with reverence in classrooms where future leaders learned about the true meaning of military service. Sometimes heroism wears a faded uniform and sits quietly in the back row, unrecognized and unassuming, asking for nothing and expecting even less. Sometimes the most important people in the room are the ones others overlook, the ones whose contributions have been forgotten by everyone except those whose lives they changed forever through single moments of extraordinary courage. Sometimes true service is measured not by the perfection of appearance, but by the depth of sacrifice and the willingness to act when action is needed regardless of personal cost. Eddie Martinez never sought recognition for his service or tried to capitalize on his decorations for personal gain. He'd returned from Vietnam, raised a family, worked as a mechanic for 40 years, and lived the quiet life of a man who'd done his duty and moved on without fanfare or expectation of reward. He wore his old uniform to General Patterson's funeral not for attention or recognition, but because it was the only formal military clothing he owned, and he wanted to show proper respect for a man who had meant something important to him. But respect isn't about perfect creases or contemporary fashion or having the latest uniform regulations memorized. Respect is about recognizing that the elderly man in the ill-fitting uniform might be the reason everyone else in the room had the opportunity to serve and succeed. Respect is understanding that heroism doesn't announce itself with fanfare or demand attention. It walks quietly among us, wearing whatever it can afford, asking for nothing but deserving everything we can give in return. The ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery became a reminder that appearance means nothing when measured against character, that the most faded uniform in the crowd might belong to the most decorated soldier present, and that true heroes don't need perfect presentation because their actions speak louder than any uniform ever could. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe someone whose quiet heroism went unnoticed, whose sacrifices were forgotten by everyone except those they helped. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.